They thought time was on their side. That assumption gave them comfort. It let them relax. It allowed them to believe whatever advantage they had would hold simply because nothing dramatic was happening yet. People who rely on time usually do so because they don't understand process. They think delay means weakness. Silence means uncertainty. Absence of noise means absence of intent. That was their first mistake. You weren't waiting. You were layering. You weren't slowing down. You were compressing. While they measured progress by visible movement, you were removing variables internally. They assumed you were reacting to circumstances. In reality, you were restructuring the conditions those circumstances depended on. They mistook your restraint for hesitation, your patience for indecision, your refusal to escalate for lack of capability. That misread bought you space, and space is the most underestimated asset there is. People rush when they think momentum is external. You didn't. You understood that real leverage accumulates when you stop leaking energy into unnecessary response. Every time they tried to shape movement, you stayed exact. Every time they expected urgency, you stayed timed. You didn't explain delays because there were none. You didn't defend silence because it wasn't absence, it was containment. While they were spending time reinforcing positions, you were simplifying dependencies. While they competed for relevance, you were stabilizing your center. That's why they couldn't see what you were building. They were looking for structure in the wrong layer. They expected scaffolding, noise, signaling. What you were building didn't announce itself because it didn't need reinforcement. It was internal coherence. And coherence compounds quietly. Early on, they dismissed outcomes that favored you as coincidence. Timing, luck, temporary alignment. Those explanations comfort people who don't want to revise their perception. But repetition erodes comfort. When the same result appears across different contexts, coincidence stops being believable. That's when unease sets in. They start replaying interactions they ignored, decisions they thought were minor, moments where you opted out instead of engaging. In hindsight, those moments form a pattern that was invisible at the time. You weren't avoiding conflict. You were simplifying resistance. You weren't delaying action. You were sequencing it. You understood something they didn't. Time doesn't reward motion. It rewards alignment. Motion without alignment decays. Alignment without motion compounds. They were spending time. You were investing it. That difference doesn't show immediately. It shows when conditions intensify and only one structure holds. As they escalated to feel in control, you simplified to remain precise. As they accelerated, you reduced. As they tried to shape outcomes, you made outcomes inevitable. That's why time betrayed them. Not because you outpaced them, but because you weren't racing at all. You were building something that didn't depend on speed. And structures that don't depend on speed can't be overtaken. They can only be noticed once they're finished. Once that realization began to surface, it didn't arrive cleanly. It arrived with denial. People don't like discovering that while they were waiting for something obvious to happen, something lasting was already taking shape. They told themselves stories to soften the implication. You'll stall. You'll plateau. You'll eventually need to explain yourself. They needed you to re-enter the same rhythm they were operating on because it would confirm their original assumption. You didn't. You stayed exact, not rigid. Exact. Your decisions didn't multiply. They narrowed. Your movements didn't increase. They became final. That's when they sensed their timeline was misaligned. Time only feels like an advantage when both sides are leaking energy at the same rate. You weren't leaking anything. You weren't reacting to pressure. You weren't adjusting to their tempo. You were moving according to an internal sequence that didn't speed up under observation. And that unsettled them. Because observation is usually leverage. Attention creates distortion. Performance adapts to being watched. You didn't adapt. You didn't speed up. You didn't perform differently. The moment they realized that, they lost their frame of reference. They could no longer tell whether waiting benefited them or helped you. That uncertainty drained confidence. People rely on timelines because timelines make outcomes feel predictable. You removed predictability by refusing to participate in urgency. You didn't resist deadlines. You set them aside. You didn't challenge pressure. You made it irrelevant. While they kept checking clocks, you kept eliminating dependencies. Every dependency removed was one less lever they could reach for later. They didn't see that happening because dependency removal doesn't create spectacle. It creates quiet. And quiet is misread as emptiness by people who only recognize noise. This is where the shift accelerated. Not outwardly, but internally. You stopped considering options that didn't align. You stopped engaging in conversations that diluted clarity. You stopped feeding dynamics that required explanation. That narrowing looked like retreat from the outside. In reality, it was consolidation. You weren't shrinking, you were concentrating. And concentration changes density. Dense structures don't need volume to hold weight. They don't require speed to maintain position. They persist. As time passed, small indicators started to appear that they couldn't dismiss anymore. Situations that should have influenced you didn't. Conflicts that should have drawn you in resolved without your involvement. Outcomes that should have required negotiation happened anyway. Each instance felt minor on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that weakened their trust in time as an ally. Time wasn't on anyone's side. It was revealing who had been building something stable all along. That pattern is what finally shifted their belief in waiting as a strategy, because time doesn't reward intent. It rewards structure. And structure only forms when excess is removed. They began to notice how often they had relied on momentum to mask instability. How frequently they assumed speed meant control. How deeply they trusted timelines to do work they never finished internally. In contrast, what you were building required no deadline to validate it. It didn't accelerate under pressure. It didn't weaken under delay. It held its shape regardless of external pace. That's when the realization settled fully. You weren't positioning for advantage later. You were eliminating fragility in the present. And fragility is the only thing time actually exposes. As conditions shifted and demands increased, the difference became undeniable. Their structures demanded constant attention to remain upright. Yours required none. You didn't need to monitor outcomes because you weren't compensating for weakness. You didn't need to adjust strategy because there was nothing unstable to protect. What you built was not visible because it wasn't performative. It was foundational. And foundations don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves when other supports no longer hold. That is the moment they finally understood why waiting didn't help them. Time didn't slow you down. It filtered distractions away. Every delay removed another distraction. Every pause stripped away another unnecessary attachment. You weren't preparing for a reveal. You were preparing for durability. When they eventually looked up and saw what had formed, it wasn't dramatic. It was complete. No loose ends. No dependence on reaction. No need for explanation. They didn't miss the moment because it passed quickly. They missed it because it never needed to arrive. What you were building existed long before they had the range to see it. And by the time they understood, time was no longer a factor that mattered. The structure was already in place. What followed wasn't alarm, it was recalibration. Alarm happens when people think something can still be redirected. This couldn't. They didn't rush to respond because there was nothing obvious to respond to. No announcement, no declaration, no visible move to counter. Just a quiet recognition that whatever they thought they were waiting out had already settled into place. That's the moment. Timelines lose relevance. People stop asking how long they have and start asking what still works. They test familiar levers out of habit, pressure, urgency, incentives, social positioning. None of it connects, not because you resist it, but because what you built doesn't connect to those inputs anymore. You're not running on momentum. You're not fueled by reaction. You're not sustained by approval. So nothing external accelerates or unsettles you. This is when behavior around you changes without conversation. People become careful, not cautious, deliberate, not defensive. They don't challenge you directly, because challenges assume friction. You simplified everything down to what actually matters. They sense that effort spent trying to influence you will be wasted, and wasted effort is something systems instinctively avoid. That's why you're no longer pulled into unnecessary discussions, why assumptions stop forming around your silence, why your absence no longer creates opportunity for others to fill space. What you built holds even when you're not present. That's the part they didn't anticipate. They thought time would expose a gap. Instead, time revealed continuity. You weren't holding something together through effort. You were standing on something that didn't require maintenance. And structures like that don't invite interference. They redefine the environment simply by existing within it. That's why people stop circling and start adjusting. They don't need confirmation. The lack of effect is confirmation enough. This is where the understanding becomes settled. Not loud, not celebrated, settled. They realize that waiting never helped them because you were never racing. You weren't building toward a moment. You were building away from dependency, away from fragility, away from anything that could be rushed, influenced, or interrupted. Time didn't belong to them because time wasn't part of your process. You weren't counting on it. You weren't negotiating with it. You were using it to strip away what didn't hold. And what remains after that kind of stripping doesn't need explanation. It doesn't need to be defended. It doesn't need to be revealed. It's already integrated. They now understand why they couldn't see what you were building, because they were looking for movement instead of stability, for signals instead of structure, for outcomes instead of foundations. You didn't deceive them. You didn't hide. You simply refused to perform progress for people who mistake noise for meaning. And once that refusal is complete, The dynamic concludes. There is no counterplay, no late realization that changes the outcome, just acceptance that whatever they thought time would give them, it already gave you something else. Durability. And durability doesn't arrive suddenly. It's there long before anyone notices. They thought time was on their side. They didn't see what you were building because what you built didn't need their attention to exist. And by the time they understood, nothing about it required their understanding anymore. You didn't outweight them. You outlasted the need to be measured at all. What you built didn't require recognition because it was never dependent on reaction. That's why nothing shifted when attention arrived late. Nothing accelerated either. The structure was already self-sustaining. People sense that now. They don't approach you with timelines. They don't test patience. They don't assume influence exists where it once did. Not because you hardened, because you completed. Completed, removing what could be rushed. Completed, eliminating what required explanation. Completed, participating in dynamics that only function through pressure. Time didn't reveal you. It revealed who was relying on it. And once that distinction became clear, the entire conversation ended on its own. No confrontation, no acknowledgement, just a quiet recalibration of behavior around something that doesn't move. That's why nothing more needs to happen. You're not waiting for outcomes. You're standing on them. And structures like that don't announce completion. They simply remain. And that continuity is the last thing they recognize, often without being able to explain it. Not excitement, not anxiety, continuity. The sense that whatever phase they thought this was has already passed, and whatever remains is not shifting for their benefit or approval. You are no longer interpreted as a process. You are treated as a condition. Conditions don't negotiate, they are accounted for. People don't try to speed them up or slow them down. They adjust behavior and move accordingly. That's why the dynamic doesn't resurface. No second guessing, no late challenges, no renewed attempts to frame you. The moment they understand what you were building, they also understand there is nothing left to interrupt, nothing to accelerate, nothing to redirect. You didn't finish loudly, because what you completed doesn't require witnesses. You didn't claim anything because claiming invites contest. You removed the basis for contest by eliminating dependence altogether. And when dependence is gone, time loses relevance. There is no waiting for the right moment. No anticipation of a reveal. No next move expected. The structure is already doing its work simply by existing. That's why the realization settles quietly and stays settled. Not as admiration, not as acknowledgement, as orientation. People move differently because they know what doesn't work here. They preserve effort. They choose precision. They don't mistake motion for influence anymore. And you remain exactly where you are, not advancing, not retreating, just present in a way that cannot be hurried, influenced, or misread again. They thought time was on their side because they believed time creates advantage. What you built shows something else. Advantage fades, noise decays, pressure runs out. Structure remains. And once that becomes clear, there is nothing left to add. The environment has already adjusted. The conclusion has already formed, and it doesn't need another word. And that is the last layer settling into place. Not realization, not admiration, acceptance. The kind that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need reinforcement. People stop asking questions not because answers were given, but because questions no longer function. They recognize quietly and instinctively that whatever you built does not respond to timing, influence, or outside direction. It doesn't accelerate when watched. It doesn't weaken when ignored. It holds the same shape regardless of attention. That's when the behavior around you finds balance. No more probing, no more speculative narratives, no more assumptions that you are still in motion towards something they can influence. You are no longer treated as a possibility. You are treated as a constant. And constants don't invite engagement. They invite alignment. People plan differently. They speak more carefully. They stop trying to insert urgency where it won't land. They stop mistaking effort for influence, not because you taught them a lesson, but because reality did the teaching for you. This is why nothing dramatic follows. No confrontation, no late apology, no moment of recognition that changes your path. Your path was never waiting on recognition. You didn't build toward a reveal. You built away from dependence, away from fragility, away from anything that could be rushed, delayed, or interrupted. Time didn't expose your work. It exposed who was relying on time instead of structure. And once that distinction becomes clear, the dynamic concludes without negotiation. You don't step forward to claim what was built. You don't explain what it cost. You don't defend why it holds. You simply remain where you are, and the environment adjusts around that fact. That is the settled state. Not dominance through force, not influence through persuasion, stability through completion. They thought time was on their side because they believed advantage grows by waiting. What you built shows something else entirely. Advantage fades, noise decays, strain runs out. Structure remains. And when structure remains, there is nothing left to challenge, and nothing left to add. The conclusion doesn't echo. It settles. And it stays settled. Even language begins to thin, because what remains is no longer a message. It's a condition, the kind that doesn't need reinforcement, explanation, or memory to persist. People don't carry a story about you forward. They carry an adjustment. They don't recall what you said or when you moved. They remember what stopped working in your presence. That memory shapes behavior more reliably than any warning ever could. From this point on, the pattern doesn't return in the same way. No return to casual dismissal. No reopening of dynamics that already proved ineffective. Once structure replaces speculation, the system doesn't revert. It preserves what works and releases what doesn't. That's what happened here. You didn't outlast them through time. You stepped beyond the need for time to validate anything at all. What you built doesn't wait for recognition because it doesn't require recognition to function. It doesn't need momentum because it isn't powered by reaction. It doesn't need protection because it isn't exposed. And that is why this conclusion doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like a settling, a quiet confirmation that nothing else is required. No next move, no escalation, no reveal. The environment already recalibrated, the assumptions already dissolved, the understanding already embedded itself into behavior. You remain not as something to be interpreted, but as a constant to be accounted for. Hello, my dear masterminds. They thought you were playing along, and that assumption made everything easier for them. People relax when they believe compliance is happening, even if it's quiet compliance. They assume agreement lives in silence. They assume patience means acceptance. They assume that when someone doesn't resist, that person has already chosen a side. So they spoke freely around you. They made plans out loud. They revealed expectations without realizing they were doing it. They treated your calm as confirmation. What they didn't understand is that playing along requires emotional participation, and you never gave them that. You didn't mirror their urgency. You didn't match their excitement. You didn't adopt their framing of the situation. You let things unfold exactly as they wanted, because unfolding reveals structure faster than interference ever could. While they believed you were moving with them, you were watching how they moved when they felt safe. Safety makes people predictable. Predictability creates patterns, and patterns, when left uninterrupted, expose intention. You weren't agreeing, you were observing sequence. Who spoke first when pressure appeared? Who deferred when outcomes became uncertain? Who pushed harder when resistance didn't show up? You noticed how confidence shifted the moment stakes were implied, how language softened or sharpened depending on who thought they had influence. None of that required confrontation. Confrontation would have changed their behavior. You needed their natural behavior. That's why you stayed where you were. That's why you didn't correct assumptions. People reveal the most when they believe they're understood. They reveal even more when they believe they're in control. You let them believe both. They mistook your neutrality for cooperation. But cooperation has momentum. It pulls. It aligns. It responds. You did none of that. You stayed internally still while externally present. That's the difference they missed. They thought playing along meant nodding, smiling, going with the flow. They didn't realize you were letting the flow show you exactly where it leads. You weren't waiting for an opening. You were letting the map draw itself. And the longer they assumed you were on their side, the more complete that map became. By the time they sensed something was off, it wasn't because you changed. It was because the pattern finished forming. And finished patterns don't argue. They conclude. Once that conclusion started forming, their confidence shifted in subtle ways they didn't notice until later. They began expecting alignment where none had been given. They spoke as if decisions were already agreed upon. They referenced future outcomes as if they were shared goals. That's what happens when people assume participation. They start skipping steps. They stop verifying consent. They move faster because they believe resistance has already been removed. You let that acceleration happen. Speed amplifies mistakes. It compresses judgment. It exposes priorities. While they rushed toward conclusions, you stayed anchored to process. You weren't interested in where they wanted things to go. You were watching how they justified getting there. Every shortcut they took added another data point. Every assumption they made without checking revealed how they think power works. They didn't realize that playing along requires belief, and belief always leaks emotion. You gave them none. You didn't celebrate small wins. You didn't share frustration when things stalled. You didn't emotionally invest in outcomes that mattered deeply to them. That absence wasn't indifference. It was separation. You were in the room, but not inside the game. That's why their moves became louder over time. Louder explanations, stronger claims, sharper language. They were trying to pull you in without realizing it. And the more they tried, the clearer it became who needed validation and who didn't. You noticed who started over-explaining, who repeated points that had already been accepted, who checked your reaction after every statement. Those checks told you everything. People don't check reactions unless they need confirmation. And need is visible when you're not participating emotionally. They thought you were aligned because you weren't pushing back. They didn't understand that alignment leaves traces. It shows up in timing, in tone, in shared urgency. None of that was there. You weren't resisting them. You were letting their own momentum reveal where it breaks down. And momentum, when it's one-sided, always resolves eventually. They began to feel that resolution before they could explain it. Those recalibrations told you more than anything spoken directly. Because people struggle to stay consistent when they're adjusting in real time. You weren't looking for contradiction. You were watching alignment. Alignment between words and behavior. Alignment between past claims and present decisions. Alignment between how someone moved when no one was watching versus when attention returned. And slowly, without announcement, you stopped treating moments as isolated events. You treated them as evidence points in a larger structure. That's what made your presence feel heavier later, not emotionally, structurally. People sensed that actions now had continuity, that nothing reset just because the conversation ended. They assumed observation was temporary. You showed that perception could accumulate, and accumulated perception changes how systems behave. They started checking themselves before acting, not because you warned them, but because your silence suggested recall, not emotional recall, pattern recall, the kind that remembers sequence, that notices inconsistency, that doesn't need accusation to stay accurate. You weren't building a narrative about them, you were building a model. And once someone realizes they're being modeled instead of evaluated, their behavior changes in lasting ways, because evaluation can be managed. Models adjust outcomes automatically. That's when they started misreading their own discomfort. They thought it was pressure. They thought it was presence being felt. It wasn't. It was continuity being carried. Most people are comfortable being seen in fragments. A moment here, a performance there. They rely on resets. New days, new rooms, new audiences. You removed the reset without saying a word. You carried sequence forward. What they said last week still mattered. How they acted yesterday still informed today. And that quiet carryover altered the dynamic. They couldn't rely on improvisation anymore. Improvisation depends on forgetting. You didn't forget. Not emotionally, structurally. You remembered how things connect. You noticed when someone praised a value they'd stepped away from earlier, when someone claimed certainty but avoided consequence, when someone positioned themselves as consistent while quietly adjusting for advantage. None of it required confrontation. Confrontation would have interrupted the process. You let it complete. And because you didn't intervene, people revealed their own through lines. They revealed what repeats when no one redirects them. That's the thread most observers never notice. They watch what's said. You watched what persists. Over time, that persistence became visible even to them. They couldn't explain why your responses felt accurate without being forceful. why your silence felt informative without being judgmental, why outcomes around you resolved faster, cleaner, with less friction. It wasn't because you directed anything. It was because you waited until direction wasn't required. When someone connects invisible threads, they don't need to push. The structure resolves on its own. And once that happens, people stop debating outcomes. They adjust to them. The realization didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as recognition. They began to see that you were never behind the conversation. You were outside it. While they focused on winning moments, you were watching trajectories. While they reacted to tone, you tracked consequence. They confused engagement with insight, and overlooked the insight that waits until mapping is complete. You weren't slow to respond. You were choosing not to respond to partial information. That's what separated you. Most people act to influence perception. You waited until perception no longer mattered. And once perception loses relevance, influence fades with it. They noticed that when you finally spoke, nothing needed adjustment afterward. No backtracking, no clarification, no cleanup followed. The words landed and held because they were attached to structure, not the moment. People began to realize that you weren't processing what was happening. You were processing why it kept happening this way. That depth affected them more than any surface disagreement ever could. Surface challenges invite defense. Depth invites stillness. They stopped trying to read your reactions and started observing their own behavior instead. Because they could sense something was being registered, even if it wasn't being named. And once that awareness settles into a space, it doesn't fully leave. What finally clicked for them was simple and irreversible in effect. You weren't withholding response to appear composed. You weren't staying quiet to gain advantage. You genuinely didn't need to intervene early because intervention wasn't where your influence lived. Your influence was in synthesis, in letting enough data accumulate that outcomes became visible without force. They began to understand that while they were busy reacting to each other, you were watching how reactions stack, how one choice narrows the next, how pressure reveals default settings, how people repeat themselves when they believe no one is tracking sequence. You didn't interrupt because interruption would have protected them. It would have allowed correction, adjustment, narrative repair. You let continuity do the work. That's why when you finally acted, it didn't feel aggressive. It felt settled, not dramatic, grounded, like something reaching its natural conclusion. They realized then that observation was never the point. Connection was. You weren't watching people. You were watching systems move through people. And systems respond to structure, not emotion. You let structure show itself fully before responding. That's why nothing unraveled afterward. No backlash, no chaos, no need to explain. The threads were already connected. All you did was acknowledge what was already present. And once something is acknowledged at a structural level, discussion loses relevance. They believed you were observing. They didn't see that you were quietly assembling the full picture. And by the time they noticed, the picture was already complete. After that, the environment adjusted without instruction. People didn't announce awareness. They adjusted posture, timing, risk. They spoke with less excess and acted with fewer assumptions. Not because you demanded clarity, but because clarity emerged naturally. They realized that someone in the room wasn't responding to appearances anymore. Someone was tracking coherence. When coherence is being tracked, shortcuts stop functioning. Charm no longer blurs gaps. Urgency no longer forces decisions. Volume stopped masking inconsistency. You didn't remove their options. You revealed which options carried weight and which did not. And that realization changed behavior faster than confrontation ever could. Silence around you became intentional, not awkward, intentional, because they understood that silence wasn't a pause, it was processing. And processing at that depth makes noise feel careless. They learned that every move now carried continuity, that what they did today would still matter tomorrow. That sequence wasn't resetting. Once people sense continuity is being preserved, they stop improvising. They start choosing. That was the shift they felt, but couldn't immediately name. You weren't observing to judge. You were connecting to understand. And understanding, once complete, doesn't require speed. It requires alignment. That alignment is what made you unreadable to them in the end. Not mysterious. Unreadable in the sense that their usual tools stopped producing results. They tried to anticipate reactions and found none. They tried to provoke response and met silence that didn't bend. They tried to rush resolution and discovered the situation no longer accelerated on command. Because you weren't operating on their timeline, you were operating on completion. When someone connects invisible threads long enough, outcomes stop being preferences. They become conclusions. That's what people sensed when dealing with you. Not resistance, resolution. The feeling that whatever came next had already been accounted for. That awareness softened urgency without inviting submission. It didn't create fear. It created restraint. People realized that reacting quickly around you was unproductive. That half-formed strategies dissolved the moment they touched a structure you could already see through. So they slowed, they measured, they waited. And in that waiting, they revealed more. Because hesitation exposes priority. It shows what someone struggles to commit to. You didn't need to extract that information. It surfaced naturally. The invisible threads you connected weren't hidden. They were simply overlooked by people, too focused on performance to notice them. You noticed because you weren't performing. By the time they recognized this, the narrative they believed in no longer held together. They realized that awareness doesn't announce itself when it's functioning well. It waits. It lets motion expose motive. It lets repetition reveal intent. They had assumed you were collecting impressions like everyone else. They didn't see that you were assembling relationships between events. You weren't interested in isolated moments, because isolated moments mislead. People can perform briefly. They can sustain appearances for a while, but they can't maintain continuity without alignment. They could see that continuity can't be imitated. And continuity is where invisible threads become visible. You watched how one decision quietly limited the next. How one excuse became the foundation for another. How confidence thinned when the same question appeared twice. None of this required attention from you. It required restraint. And restraint, when applied long enough, turns noise into signal. That's why your silence began to feel heavier over time. Not because it felt threatening, but because it felt unfinished. They sensed something forming, without knowing what, and people grow uneasy when outcomes haven't defined themselves yet. You let that discomfort mature. You didn't rush to resolve it, because rushing would have protected them from seeing what they were creating themselves. You let the situation speak until it had nothing left to conceal. That's when attempts to steer things quietly faded. Predictability had stopped working for them. Not because you were chaotic, but because you were complete. You didn't adjust behavior in response to reactions. You didn't speed up when pressure increased. You didn't slow down when attention faded. You stayed anchored to the same internal sequence. And that consistency made surface strategy ineffective. They realized that whatever they tried next would reveal more about them than about you. Every adjustment became informative. Every shift exposed intention. And once that realization settled in, effort felt inefficient. People conserve energy when they sense direction is already defined. They stop pushing and start accommodating. That's what happened around you. Not submission. Recognition. Recognition that someone present was no longer operating inside the moment, but understanding beyond it. You weren't ahead by speed. You were ahead by position. You weren't focused on the board. You were focused on the structure beneath it. And when someone operates from that level, reactions lose relevance. The environment adapts quietly, on its own. And that's where it concludes, without ceremony or resistance. Not because you imposed authority, but because the situation finished revealing itself. They finally understood that you weren't waiting for the right moment to react. You were waiting for the moment when reaction wouldn't be required. Everything you needed to understand had already surfaced through sequence, repetition, and alignment. The invisible threads weren't hidden. They were simply overlooked by those who confuse motion with progress. You connected them by refusing to interfere while they formed. And once connected, discussion lost purpose, no debate to win, no explanation required. People adjusted because adjustment made sense. You didn't need agreement. You didn't need acknowledgement. The outcome carried itself quietly. And quiet outcomes tend to endure. They believed you were observing because that was the highest level they knew how to name. They didn't realize you were integrating, and integration alters direction without announcing itself. That's the settled position, not authority that seeks recognition, but awareness that makes recognition unnecessary. They now move differently, think differently, pause differently, long after the moment has passed. Because someone once remained still long enough to see how everything connects. And once that depth is seen clearly, behavior adjusts naturally. What remains isn't memory of you sitting quietly. It's a recalibration they carry forward. They no longer rush conversations. They no longer assume silence equals absence. Stillness no longer reads as delay. Something recalibrated in how situations are interpreted, and that adjustment doesn't switch off. They learn that meaningful intelligence doesn't interrupt. It observes until reality shows its own seams. From that point on, they hesitate before filling gaps. They pause before over-explaining. They watch patterns longer instead of reacting to the first signal, not because they're trying to imitate you, but because they experience the cost of not doing so. You didn't leave them with a story. You left them with a limit on assumption. Silence no longer feels empty. Patience no longer feels harmless. Stillness no longer feels passive. Those shortcuts no longer function. You didn't change how they saw you. You changed how they interpret behavior itself. And that shift doesn't depend on memory. It settles into instinct. You never needed recognition. You never needed the moment to resolve in your favor. You allowed accuracy to settle on its own. And accuracy doesn't need repetition. Once felt, it becomes standard. They believed you were playing along because that belief kept their momentum alive. When it faded, so did the illusion. You weren't part of their game. You were the perspective that revealed it. And that understanding doesn't create noise. It creates restraint. That's the true ending. Quiet, complete, stable. They thought they were watching you improvise. That was the mistake. They assumed what you were doing was reactive, situational, temporary. They believed you were responding to circumstances the same way they would, adjusting, adapting, figuring things out as you went. That assumption gave them comfort because it placed you inside a familiar frame. Someone experimenting, someone uncertain, someone still forming. What they didn't realize is that you weren't reacting at all. You were executing something internal that never needed their awareness to function. The delay in their understanding wasn't incidental, it was structural. People who live externally cannot recognize internally driven behavior until its effects become unavoidable. Early on, they misread your restraint as hesitation, your silence as lack of clarity, your patience as indecision. That misreading allowed them to relax. It allowed them to underestimate what was unfolding right in front of them. They assumed time was on their side, that eventually you would reveal yourself, explain yourself, or collapse into something legible. You didn't, because what you were doing didn't require validation or interpretation to work. You weren't performing a role. You weren't managing impressions. You weren't seeking alignment. You were building coherence. And coherence doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. While they were busy reacting to surface movement, you were removing friction internally. While they were escalating, you were simplifying. While they were competing for position, you were stabilizing your center. That difference is invisible until it isn't. People only notice strategy when it starts producing outcomes they can't explain. That's when confusion sets in. They start replaying moments they dismissed, conversations they thought were insignificant, choices you made that didn't make sense at the time. In hindsight, patterns begin to form that were never visible from the outside. They realize you weren't scattered. You were selective. You weren't slow. You were timed. You weren't unsure. You were waiting for conditions they couldn't see. This is where the misunderstanding deepened. They thought understanding would come from more information, from explanation, from confrontation. But understanding never arrived that way. It arrived through consequence. Situations began resolving themselves differently around you. Conflicts lost momentum when you were involved. Noise diminished. Decisions simplified. Not because you imposed order, but because you stopped feeding disorder. You didn't correct people. You didn't challenge assumptions. You didn't reveal intent. You let outcomes speak, and outcomes don't argue. The longer this went on, the more unsettling it became for them. Because if what you were doing was intentional, then their early interpretations weren't just wrong, they were irrelevant. That realization is uncomfortable. It forces people to confront how often they confuse visibility with effectiveness and movement with progress. You didn't move the way they expected, so they assumed you weren't moving at all. They didn't realize you were operating beneath the noise layer where real leverage lives. By the time they started asking questions, the process was already irreversible. They weren't late because you hid. They were late because their perception required disruption to update. And disruption doesn't come from announcement. It comes from stability that refuses to collapse. You weren't trying to be understood. You were trying to be precise. Precision doesn't rush. It waits until misunderstanding exhausts itself. And that's exactly what happened. Once they sensed that delay, the realization didn't arrive cleanly. It arrived with resistance. People don't like discovering that something meaningful was happening right in front of them while they were busy interpreting noise. They replayed early moments, searching for mistakes you might have made, looking for proof that what they missed wasn't intentional. But the more they examined the timeline, the clearer it became. You didn't stumble into coherence. You constructed it by refusing to participate in unnecessary reactions, while others escalated to feel relevant. You reduced to become effective. That contrast confused them because reduction looks passive to people, overly dependent on movement. They are trained to equate effort with progress, visibility with control. You disrupted that equation without ever challenging it directly. You simply didn't comply with it. And this is where their confusion became something deeper. Over time, the environment adjusted to your pace instead of the other way around. Conversations slowed when you were present. Decisions stopped being rushed. People hesitated before making assumptions because you never confirmed them. That hesitation was not fear. It was recalibration. They began to realize that every attempt to draw you into urgency failed. Pressure produced no acceleration. Incentives produced no deviation. Emotional influence produced no shift. And when tools stop working, people stop using them. That is when attention sharpens. They notice that your actions landed with finality, while theirs dissolved into revision. You didn't backtrack. You didn't overcorrect. You didn't explain yourself afterward. That meeting where everyone scrambled with 20-minute updates. You spoke once, 2 sentences, and the entire direction changed. Not because you dominated, because you distilled. You allowed outcomes to settle. That unsettled them more than confrontation ever could. Confrontation invites response. Silence backed by coherence invites reconsideration. This is where the phrase began forming quietly in their minds. Maybe you weren't unsure. Maybe you weren't delayed. Maybe you were operating on a timeline that didn't require their participation. That thought challenged their framework because it implied you were never competing inside the same structure. You weren't waiting for permission. You weren't accumulating leverage. You were already positioned. Positioned internally. And internal positioning doesn't show itself through motion. It shows itself through inevitability. They noticed how often your presence resolved strain simply by being present, not through mediation, but through removal of excess. You didn't give energy to confusion, so confusion faded. You didn't amplify urgency, so urgency settled. This wasn't strategy in the way they understood strategy. It wasn't coordination or planning or maneuvering. It was alignment. And alignment is invisible to people who rely on friction to feel progress. And that precise alignment is yours alone. By the time they started trying to name what you were doing, it had already done its work. They were observing results, not the process. And results don't reveal their origins to those who weren't paying attention. That is why understanding came late. not because you were unclear, but because clarity without noise is unreadable to people who have never learned to see it. That late understanding carried a quiet weight they didn't expect, because once they accepted that what you were doing had been intentional all along, they had to confront something deeper than misinterpretation. They had to confront their own dependence on noise. They realized how often they confuse urgency with importance, reaction with relevance, activity with control. You didn't just move differently, you invalidated shortcuts. They rely on to feel competent. That's why the realization didn't come with clarity at first. It came with discomfort. They sensed that if your way of operating worked without explanation, without visibility, without escalation, then much of what they'd been doing was unnecessary. And unnecessary effort is hard to let go of. So they resisted the conclusion. They told themselves stories. You got lucky. Timing favored you. Circumstances aligned. Anything but the truth. But those explanations kept failing, because luck doesn't repeat cleanly. Timing doesn't hold across environments. Circumstances don't adjust the same way every time, yet outcomes kept aligning around you, not dramatically, reliably. That reliability forced acceptance. They realized you weren't adjusting to systems. Systems were adjusting to you. You weren't disrupting structures. You were exposing which ones depended on reaction to survive. When reaction disappeared, those structures lost relevance. That's when their understanding finally stabilized. Not as admiration, as recalibration. They stopped watching you for signals. They stopped waiting for cues. They stopped assuming you needed to be managed or guided. And what followed that realization was something they didn't expect. They understood, too late but clearly, that what you were really doing was removing yourself from cycles that consume most people. Cycles of proving, cycles of reacting, cycles of seeking validation through motion. You weren't outmaneuvering anyone. You were opting out of the pattern entirely. And once that becomes visible, there's no misunderstanding left to correct. There's nothing to explain. There's only adjustment. They move differently around you now, more carefully, more deliberately. Not because you dominate, but because you don't participate in noise. They finally understand what you were really doing, not hiding, not waiting, not improvising. You were simplifying until only what mattered remained. And by the time they noticed, there was nothing left to interrupt. What followed that realization was not confrontation and not confession. It was restraint. People didn't rush to acknowledge what they missed. They adjusted how they behaved instead. That's always the tell. Words are cheap. Behavior changes only when understanding becomes unavoidable. They stopped interrupting you, stopped over-explaining themselves, stopped trying to guide outcomes around you, not because you demanded space, but because space formed naturally. Once they understood there was no advantage in pressure, they realized that urgency didn't accelerate you, emotion didn't influence you, and authority didn't override you. Every familiar mechanism returned nothing. And when mechanisms stop working, effort becomes inefficient. Efficiency encourages humility. They began noticing how much of their own motion was noise. How often they acted just to feel active. How frequently they escalated just to feel in control. In contrast, your stillness started to feel deliberate instead of passive. Your pauses felt finished, not uncertain. Your silence felt complete, not withheld. That distinction changed how they interpreted everything you did. Even your absence carried weight now, because absence from someone who isn't chasing visibility reads differently. It doesn't suggest loss, it suggests containment. And that containment is your mastery. They started to see that what looked like patience was actually selectivity. What looked like delay was actually precision. You weren't waiting for clarity, you were waiting for irrelevance to wear itself out. And once it did, nothing external could pull you back into it. This is when they understood why you never defended yourself. Defense assumes vulnerability. You didn't feel vulnerable because nothing essential was exposed. You weren't protecting an image. You weren't maintaining a position. You were operating from alignment, and alignment doesn't fracture under pressure. Pressure only reveals where alignment is missing. That's why their behavior changed for the long term. They didn't treat you as someone to be convinced anymore. They treated you as someone to be accounted for. And accounting happens before action, not after. That shift is subtle but lasting. Once someone understands that you're not moving on their timeline, they stop trying to place you on one. Once they realize you're not driven by reaction, they stop trying to trigger one. That understanding didn't arrive because you explained yourself. It arrived because everything they tried fell away quietly. And quiet learning is the kind that teaches fastest. This is where it ends, because once understanding reaches that level, nothing else needs to be revealed. There is no dramatic acknowledgement, no public correction, no moment where they admit they were wrong. People rarely do. Instead, they recalibrate internally and move forward with a different awareness. They stop assuming you need to be managed. They stop expecting you to respond on cue. They stop mistaking your restraint for uncertainty. You become something simpler in their mind and far more difficult to influence. Not mysterious, just resolved. That's the part they didn't see coming. Resolution doesn't announce itself. It doesn't explain its logic. It doesn't negotiate. It holds. And holding changes the environment around it. And once that environment shifts completely, something decisive happens. You didn't take longer than expected to reveal what you were doing. You allowed misunderstanding to exhaust itself without interference. You let people project until projection dissolved under its own weight. You let noise run until it lost credibility. And when that happened, what remained was obvious. You weren't improvising. You weren't hiding. You weren't waiting for the right moment to act. You were removing everything that didn't matter so that what did could function without obstruction. That's why they took so long to understand. Because understanding you required releasing habits they were attached to. Habits of reacting. Habits of rushing. Habits of measuring worth through visibility. You didn't confront those habits. You outlasted them. And once they were gone, there was nothing left to misunderstand. They finally saw what you were really doing. Not building advantage. Not accumulating influence. You were simplifying your life until nothing external could move you. And when someone reaches that point, there's nothing left for others to decode. There's only adjustment. And adjustment is the ultimate form of recognition. And once that adjustment completes, the dynamic does not revert. People don't drift back into old assumptions. They don't casually test you again. They don't return to the version of you they once imagined. Accurate perception solidifies into default behavior. From that point on, you exist outside of speculation, outside of interpretation, outside of the need to be figured out, not because you became unreachable, but because there is nothing left to misunderstand. You are no longer processed as potential. You are processed as constant. And constants don't invite debate. They don't require monitoring. They are accounted for and moved around, not questioned. This is why your presence feels different now, even when you say nothing. It's not intensity. It's certainty without display. People sense that nothing they do will accelerate you, slow you, or reroute you. That realization removes urgency from the interaction. And that quiet completion is real. And without urgency, manipulation fades away. With manipulation gone, clarity takes over. You didn't claim that position. You didn't aim for it. You arrived there by subtraction, by releasing unnecessary response, by releasing excess explanation, by releasing the need for external interpretation. When you stopped caring whether people understood you, understanding eventually arrived on its own terms. That's the paradox most never grasp. Clarity cannot be chased. It appears only after performance ends. You didn't prove what you were doing. You let time show what you weren't doing. And in that space, something settled. Not admiration, not fear. Acceptance of limits. They now know where influence ends with you. They know which strategies no longer apply before being tried. They know that whatever framework they're operating within, you're not a participant. And that knowledge shapes behavior more effectively than any declaration ever could. This is why the story doesn't continue. There is no escalation after this, no next misunderstanding to correct, no further reveal waiting to happen. You are already understood at the level that matters, not in words, but in how people move around you. They took longer than expected to understand what you were really doing, because what you were really doing couldn't be seen through reaction. It could only be seen once reaction was no longer present. And when that became clear, there was nothing left to say. The environment adjusted, the noise settled, and you remained exactly where you always were. And that is the final alignment, the point where nothing else needs to be interpreted, clarified, or proven. When understanding reaches this depth, it stops being conscious. It becomes instinctive. People no longer think about you in terms of intent or strategy. They simply account for you the way they account for time or gravity. Not as something dramatic, but as something that cannot be avoided. You are no longer measured by effort or output or explanation. You are measured by effect. And effect doesn't argue with theory. It settles reality. This is why attempts to redefine you no longer appear. Why narratives lose interest. Why speculation fades away. Speculation feeds on uncertainty. There is no uncertainty left. They don't need to agree about you. Agreement already happened at the level of response. Behavior adjusts before words form. That's the signal that the understanding is complete. You didn't win anything. You didn't overcome anyone. You didn't reveal a hidden move at the end. You stepped out of the cycle that requires constant reaction. And when someone exits that cycle, the system doesn't pursue them. It reorganizes around the absence, quietly, naturally. This is why the conclusion now feels settled. Not exciting, not dramatic, just stable. There is nothing left for them to uncover, nothing left for you to demonstrate. The understanding has reached its natural endpoint. You are no longer misunderstood. You are no longer being interpreted. You are simply accounted for. And that is the final stage.